to our Marcela Andokova, our old friend and expert on Augustine. So she will give a talk on Fatum est infirmioris potentioris voluntas, Augustine on faith and astrology revisited. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dragana. Is there anyone of us, my dear colleagues, who wouldn't come across a situation in his or her life when we wouldn't ask ourselves, why is this happening to me? Is it always my responsibility, or is it by chance that it happens to me, or by God's providence, or by fate, or what? Don't expect answer from me. I am not an expert to say, but I would like to talk to you a little bit about the way how Augustine understands this topic, which has been scrutinized and tackled down by many scholars, and especially Shai Sun, who has recently written on Augustine's understanding of Stoic fate and free will in De Civitate Dei, which I find of particular importance in my research. And next slide, thank you. The cause of the greatness of the Roman Empire is neither chance nor fate, because, as Augustine says in the beginning of his 5th book of De Civitate Dei, human kingdoms are established by God's providence. And it is precisely this book which is of importance for my research today, because it happened in 410 that Alaric sacked the Rome, and people were asking, why is this happening to us? What is this for? It's because of Christians who stopped worshipping our gods, or what has happened? And Augustine finds a better answer for that. It's always divine providence, will, and power who is responsible for this. Next slide, please. And here you will not see very well if I move like that. So we see how Augustine, in the beginning of this 5th book, thinks of fate, fatum in Latin. And he says that fate, in his times, when people heard this word, they immediately thought of natal horoscopes or of astrological signs which govern our lives in the very moment of our birth. But, as he continues, some people think that this is independent of God's will and power. The other thing, that it depends on God. And I haven't put it on the slide, but apparently he says that he's not going to discuss anything with those who think that our fates are governed only by celestial bodies who do not have soul and reason, because it's simple blasphemy and nonsense. But on the other hand, he continues saying that if ever people think that God gives power to celestial bodies to decide on our lives, on our perspectives, on our careers, health, and happy or unhappy lives, that these people are really doing injustice to God. And why? Because he would deprive God of his capacity to judge human actions. It wouldn't have any sense, because God's judgment is one of the things Christianity is based on, but for Augustine, it is more his misericordia, that judgment is closely connected with it. And what is interesting, on the bottom of this slide, what we see is that he comes back to astrologers, and he says, well, some astrologers, whom he called mathematici in his time, would say that it's not like celestial bodies, Venus, Mars, or other planets and stars decide on our lives, but only predict what will happen in the future. And these people are not so far from the truth, but should correct their language. And as we saw also on the previous slide, Augustine thinks that even Stoics who think that fate can mean God's will or power, these people are not far from the truth, but should correct their language as well. Now we see, yes, that the problem is the language, the perspective we take. Is it that we all see things differently, or that we don't use common language, or where is the problem? The next slide will show us how Augustine treats this problem in chapter 9 of his book 5 of De Civitate Dei, where he summarizes all important aspects or opinions regarding the faith. Stoic faith, represented first of all by Seneca, whom he owed a lot in his professional life and in his philosophy, would say that faith is the chain of actions, of causes, and that God stands at the source of all these chains of causes. Good. So Stoics were not so far, although they used different language. But on the other hand, Cicero and his perspective was criticized a lot by Augustine, because Cicero, especially in his treatise De Fato on faith, which hasn't been preserved in its totality, and which Cicero wrote in the end of his career, that is to say, at the end of his life, 44 BC, Cicero criticizes all Stoic view of faith, saying that if the faith and God, who stands at the source of the faith, or at the beginning of all causes, governs everything in our lives, we don't have any free will. And it means if we don't have free choice of will, we are not responsible for any of our actions. We are not responsible for good or for evil, for nothing. And Augustine, which is very interesting, criticizes you much more than the view of astrologers, who could accept that somehow God can stand behind these fatal aspects of our life or of astrological constellations. So we see how it works for Augustine. He criticizes in book 5 astrology. He criticizes Cicero. Mostly, he accepts the doctrines of Stoic philosophers. But now, how does it really work? Do we all use different perspectives? Let's look at the next slide. Here, I make a sketch. And we see the parable of blind man and an elephant, which is hugely known, especially in Hindu or Buddhist religions or cultures. And here we can see one blind man can approach and touch the trunk of the elephant and says, it's a snake. The other one stands by his side and thinks it's a wall, and the third one touches the tail, saying it's a rope. Could we see these Augustinian developments in De Civitate Dei 5 from this perspective, or is it completely different? Next slide. Thank you, Dragana. Now we can see how Augustine views the Stoic philosophy. He accepts that for them, the will and power of God is the source of fate. And then, as you saw in the very first slide of my presentation, voluntas, or will, is crucial point for Augustine in his development of this topic in this book of his De Civitate Dei. So we can accept Stoic developments of this topic, although they need to be corrected, because in their view, free will is not given a significant place or sufficient place as it should be put in Christianity. Now, the next slide, the criticism of Cicero, as I have already mentioned, is obvious. Free will, yes, because people in Christianity, as Augustine believes, are not deprived of free will, but in their free will, they should do what is good for them and what has been seen before the world began in God's providence. So apparently this doesn't work well, but free will could be accepted. And then, next slide is astrology. Although Augustine accepts that astrologers can use a different language and can also talk only about predictions, not only about decisions of celestial bodies. However, they are mistaken and their doctrines should be refuted. And the major argument Augustine uses, and not only in De Civitate Dei, as we will see in the course of my presentation today, is that the argument of twins. The two are born in the same moment, but the two of them, no, definitely not in the same moment, because Dragana will know it much better than me, at least some minutes. 10 minutes. 10 minutes, very good, thank you. Conditions, different jobs, different fate. And this is not Augustine's argument, of course. He has taken it from Cicero, who was against astrologers, and from Greek philosophers. So here we see that he is refuting, we cannot accept simply astrologers, because this is the main argument against. And now we will continue a little bit further on. Okay, there has been so much written about fate and Stoic philosophy in Augustine's De Civitate Dei, but by chance or by fate, I do not know, during this academic year, when I was thinking of coming for the conference to Belgrade to see my friends and colleagues again, I met a friend from secondary school years whom I haven't seen for ages. And she's an accountant and at the same time an astrologer. But she doesn't make fortune by making horoscopes. It's just like her hobby. And I asked her, why do the people come to you to ask for a natal horoscope mostly? And the answer was, you know, they usually want to know whether they will be rich and successful in their career, whether they will have happy lives. And I said, and if ever the stars do not say that, do not predict that, what then? I cannot say it openly. And this conversation, to be honest, helped me to choose the precise direction of my today's talk. And here on this slide, we see the first preserved natal horoscope, which was made for Antiochus I in 62, and it was carved into the stone on top of Tarsus Mountain. And it is a lion who has a sickle or a crescent under his neck, you can see, and then the constellation of Leo, apparently, as you can see also on the bottom of the right side. And this was the first natal horoscope, as I said, we know about. If we consider the Greek culture and religion, Greeks since the 5th century before Christ were deeply interested in these topics, in dreams, as we have heard this morning, or even in horoscopes, which they find inspiration by Babylonians who had this interest in astrology already in second millennium before Christ, but it came much later to Rome. Because, of course, it was Julius Caesar, thank you, next slide, who made a reform of calendar in 46, because before years didn't have the same number of days, and so the year was not always as long as the previous year. So apparently natal horoscopes, genetliaci, couldn't have had so much success. But with Julius Caesar, something interesting happens. The citation from Plutarch's Bioi Paralleloi, which we have on the slide, we do not learn that Caesar had his natal horoscope, but we see that there was a seer who predicted bad things happening to Caesar on of March 43. And apparently this happened, that he died on the way to the Senate House. He met this man who said, yes, the Ides of March are come, but are not gone. And we know the end of Caesar, what happened that year. And what is of more interest or more bigger importance for us is what happened afterwards. During the mourning for Caesar, what happened? A strange comet appeared in the sky with flaming tail. And for Romans who love omens and signs and who were observing the skies and everything, unlike us who are very rational people, they observed this comet and said, although usually comet doesn't bring anything positive to the Romans, this time is something special. And they came with the idea that it was like confirmation of the divinity of Caesar. And we know that 2 years later, we see the reconstruction of the temple on the slide. The deification of Caesar was completed thanks to Octavian, and the temple was erected to Caesar on the Forum, and at the back of this temple, also this comet with flaming tail was fixed. And now we have come across an idea that observing celestial bodies can tell us a lot and can be significant, especially for ruling elite. It is in the turn of the 1st century before Christ and the 1st century of our era that this interest in natal horoscopes start to take importance, as we will see in the next slide. And in tabloid press of antiquity, please let me say it in this way, in Suetonius's Lives of Caesars, we can read about Augustus, about Octavianus Augustus, how he was raised to power. And it was precisely by predictions of a fortune teller or of an astrologer, better to say, who predicted him in Apollonia, Illyria, nowadays, who predicted him fantastic future, not only to Agrippa, but also to Augustus. Although Augustus did not want to say his date of birth because he was afraid, of course, of what would be said to him, but finally agreed to that and saw how wonderful career was awaiting him in the future, he was pretty much convinced of his position in society. Although he was saying that I am a princeps, the first among the equals, in reality, what we see on the coins, we see him very often crowned with laurels, leaves, which symbolizes a kingship. And we can see his coin where he writes Capricorn, his moon sign. In fact, I have learned it. I am not a specialist, as I said, in astrology, but I have learned that his sun sign was Libra. But for Romans and ancient people, moon sign was much more important, and he was having precisely Capricorn as his moon sign. So that's why we can find these wonderful silver coins with the Capricorn and Augustus. And this was important for my research in the topic, because it's how astrology took breath in the Roman Empire. Augustus find the grounds for his rule. He, in the year 11 of our era, gave a ban on astrology, I mean on natal horoscopes. And we can ask why he did it if he believed in these horoscopes. And the answer, I think, would be why, I don't say obvious, because maybe at first sight we can say it's because he thought it was a pseudoscience and we shouldn't believe in these things. But the reason for that was that he was already in his 70s, and many people probably wanted to know more about his natal horoscope in order to help him go to another side with Charon on the boat. And that's why he put a ban on that. He was probably the first one to learn about that in the history of Roman emperors, but not the last, definitely, because we know the same thing about the Emperor Hadrian, who was a very skillful astrologer. Every year on the 1st of January, on January calends, he made his own horoscope, and he even knew the date of his death. But those who would be happy to know this natal horoscope were threatened by death punishment. So we can see that family succession or the race power, these are the things which are very often connected with natal horoscopes in the first century after Christ. What will be interesting about them in later centuries of the later empire, we will see very soon. But first, maybe next slide, please. We see how it fits with the horoscopes and with all divinations, soothsayers, magicians, and augurs on the 1st of January, 439, Theodosianus IV, and was completely forbidden to practice astrology and all other kinds of magic practices. It was already a Christian empire, but it was still of great importance to declare publicly. And why was it so important, we will see right now with Augustine. Next slide. And Augustine, as a bishop, was a man who was very clever, had a shiny career as a rhetorician, as a teacher of rhetoric in his 20s, and he was deeply interested in astrology, as we will see immediately. But when he became a bishop in 396 in Hipporegius, nowadays Annaba in Algeria, he started to write this fantastic treatise, De Doctrina Christiana. We can call it on Christian doctrine or on Christian education, but none of these words I can find are good enough to translate it. But in the second book of this treatise, we learn about Christian culture, which shouldn't be based anymore on liberal arts, artes liberales, but on the teaching of the Bible. And among other things treated in the second book, we also learn about magical practices, about superstitious practices, which were very common at this time. I mean, Romans list omens everywhere. If the cat has crossed the street, it was a sign. If the doors were open or just banged, it was a sign. Everything was a sign for them. So Augustine warns his believers who would read his treatise against these practices. And among other things, he also criticizes astrology that was very popular, not only among rulers of the time, but among people. We can understand that also among those who were illiterate and had no public prestige as he used to have before. And he says that although it's not connected with worshipping idols, it should be rejected because it doesn't promote Christian faith, because people would worship Mars, Venus, and other stars more than their creator. And now, next slide, please, we come back to his confessions. I mean, you might have an impression that what he tells us, what he recounts us in his confession preceded the Doctrina Christiana, but in fact, Augustine started to write this treatise or these 13 books on his confessions only a year or two later than his first 3 books of the Doctrina Christiana. And in book 4, he spent some time talking about astrology. And we can find in his citations that for him, astrology was very important, that he didn't only consult astrologers, but he himself learned to make natal horoscopes. And he was very good at it. And we do not know, there are also loads of books written or articles on the topic, but no one can say when precisely he started to be interested in this. But I guess it was very soon when he started to teach rhetoric, to work in the court as a lawyer, defending the causes, etc., etc. And one word which is interesting for me, why he rejects astrology, because we will see that he is not certain. He has an impression that many times these horoscopes tell the truth. But how is it possible? Because celestial bodies don't have reason. But he has this problem. But he says that for the reasons of pride, I was consulting astrologers. He wanted to be successful. And for his success, he was searching for the answer of astrologers. Next slide, please. as we see on this slide, he met one older man called Vindicianus, who was a medical doctor, and asked him why horoscopes are true. And the answer, the best answer ever Vindicianus could give to Augustine was, it was by chance, which is very common and spread in the nature. Augustine does not believe in chance, but maybe this was the best way how to persuade himself that it. We will see more implications. So definitely, when he becomes a Christian in his 30s, when he is baptized in Milan, he gives up astrology forever, and he starts not only to reject it but fight against it. And next slide, thank you. We will see how he supports the argument in book 7 of his Confessions. Again, we find similar topic tackled down again. And here, again, as we saw in one of the first slides, he uses the argument of the twins born in the same time. He, this time, mentions the twins from the book of Genesis, like Esau and Jacob, who had different destinies. And he says that, yes, this is the argument we should all obey, and this is the most rational argument against astrology, although it often brings us true information. And next slide, not to speak too much in the afternoon, I was interested, okay, the Doctrina Christiana, Confessions, or De Civitate Dei are his famous, most important treatises. But what about his preaching activity? Because I've been dealing with Augustine's preaching for years. So I looked up a little bit in his exegetic homilies on the Gospel of John, and I found some interesting findings there. And he says that pagans go to see fortune tellers and astrologers because it's normal for them, and they don't worship God, and they do it openly. But Christians in the of the 4th century, or better to say in the beginning, yes, in the beginning of the 5th century, because we are in the year 407 or 408, go to see astrologers, clam, so secretly. So here we see that this practice was really spread out widely. And in the next slide, we will see how he treats the topic. I didn't want to make it too long, so I have skipped some other citations from this homily, but they are of great interest to me because he uses his arguments not only against astrologers, but also against heretics of his time. And he is showing, based on biblical citations, how astrologers tried to convince people that, for example, even Jesus Christ was dependent on faith. My time hasn't yet come, they would say. So we can see astrologers who wanted to make money, who wanted to be rich enough, probably, try to put people in a trap by using their own weapons. And Augustine apparently explains in the homily how people should understand it based on other biblical citations. So we can see in preaching, we find examples of his refusal of astrology put in the words which are acceptable and understandable also to a more educated audience. On the slide, we will see how he understands it even better. In homily 10 on John's Gospel, Augustine would say to us, based on prophetic words from the prophet, that sins can be accumulated and become as a long rope, which we can be entrapped by. And he says, you commit a theft, and instead of accepting what you have done because you have committed a theft, it's a kind of crime, you go to consult the astrologer to see what will happen, whether you will be put to prison or not, and you commit another sin, so it's the second sin. Then you revile your bishop who scorches you, it's the third sin, and then you say, I'm not going to be a Christian anymore, I'll join the party of Donatus. It was the schismatic church of his time in the north of Africa. And it's the fourth sin. And like that, the rope is becoming longer and longer. So here we see that what astrology does, instead of taking one's responsibility for one's actions, it promotes all bad consequences in Christian lives. And Augustine, as a bishop, had to fight it. Next slide, please. To put it shortly, based on what I have read in his homilies and in his treatises, I find that although sometimes Augustine is not clear enough that for him astrology is not completely meaningful. Why? Maybe because he doesn't want to acknowledge it, or maybe because he didn't want to make it longer in his confessions. I do not know. I am not searching for the answer of this kind, but I find four reasons to fight against astrology. It's theological objection or theological objections. We can see that people were very often misled by astrology, like forgetting that God's providence stands in the beginning of their lives, and that God's will and power rule their life, although they are free in their will. So this is the theological objection. Then logical inconsistencies. It's what I have already mentioned. Celestial bodies do not have reasons and do not have souls, so how can they decide? Then we have empirical experience based on this argument of twins born in the very same moment, for example. So it doesn't work. And the last, and I think for a Christian bishop, as Augustine was, a very important point was moral implications, which means that for him, people would lose responsibility for their actions. And that's what he couldn't accept in his life. And we can put another slide, and we are almost at the end. Coming back to De Civitate Dei 5. Here again, we have a citation from this book where he makes a recourse to Stoic philosophy. And here we see why all those Stoics did not use the same language, and very often we could be in polemic with them about the fate, which people cannot avoid, was so dear to Augustine. And he uses the Stoic sentence, it's the sentence by Cleanthes, the Greek philosopher, taken by Seneca, which is famous and known to each of us, I believe, and it's volentem patent, olentem trahunt. So here, Augustine tries to convince his readers that God's will is the source of our freedom and of our fate, and if we cooperate with God's providence and with his will, with his voluntas, we will not be misled lives. So that's why volentem fata adunt. And I put on the bottom of the slide another sentence by Seneca. It's from his De Beata Vita, which I like, where he says that Deo parere libertas est. To obey God is freedom. So it's in line with the first citation I have mentioned before. And we have come to the end, and the last slide, it's just the English version of the very first sentence I mentioned. If we should talk about fate, then we should attribute it to the weaker of the two parties, and will, voluntas, to the stronger who has the weaker in his power. So here Augustine clearly says that the will of God is our fate. Thank you for your attention.
I suppose that many of us would like the question, but anyway, so please, one or two questions.
I'm sorry, no, I'm sitting.
You can see.
Okay. Because for Christians, there's free will. I was wondering, how this aligns with some of the seeming this seems to suggest that it's not that prophecies are predicting the mirror. It's just these ones in particular answer that. I don't know how that balances. Thank you.
It's precisely the thing Augustine is talking about in the chapters of De Civitate Dei I have mentioned. And his argument of prophecies to confirm God's foreknowledge of things, that he knows everything, is not a part of time, so he knows everything, and the prophets are given this knowledge by God. So that's it, that prophecies are okay because they just confirm God's foreknowledge and his will. So, I mean, I think I would too much, because after finishing his Saturday, he finally comes to his doctrine of predestination. And this is not a very happy part of his teaching, but definitely confirm God's foreknowledge and omniscience.
Thank you for your great talk. I have a question about the relationship between St. Augustine and the Stoics. So one of the reasons why you said Augustine is kind of against the Stoic view on fate is because the Stoics don't really accommodate for free will.
Exactly.
But then I'm wondering, can you say how Augustine actually understood free will? I mean, we know how the Epicureans try to do that in their debate with the Stoics, but I'm just wondering, what was Augustine's sort of deeper thinking about this? What are the assumptions or philosophical foundations for that, if he had any? And then on the other hand, just very briefly, a follow-up question. I'm confused a little bit. So in the end, is Augustine a Christian fatalist in the end, or does he believe that there is robust free will, which kind of, in my mind at least, doesn't really go along with some strong determinism or fatalism?
Thank you very much for it's very good. Yes, I think in the end, life is, as I mentioned, when it comes to the doctrine, because for him, he believes in God's mercy and in God's judgment, but for him, it's very hard to understand why certain people would accept God, would obey his will, and why others not. So finally, in this way, God knows everything before the world starts. He knows even if I accept him, will be saved or not. But at the same time, he says, we still have free will, which means that we can and we should find the ways God has prepared for us. And we still have the right to say no. I think with the combination of constant understanding of free and destination doesn't affect love. That's what it's his understanding. So we have free choice. I mean, if God in his foreknowledge knows that we will accept him, he will give us strength to decide in our free will in accordance with his effort for us.
With his gratia.
Yes, that's it, with his gratia.
With his gratia.
For example, you can consult his later work from 426. It's the Gratia Libero Arbitrium, where precisely he says in paragraph, I think 21, something like that, you can check it, where he says, yes, we are, God knows what will happen to us in the future, whether we will be saved or not, but still gives us this free will. Yes.
Thank you. I want to thank you once again. Before I introduce the second speaker, I just wanted to add, because Marcela mentioned De Fato, now we have the first Serbian translation of this work by Professor Vladimir Marko from the University of Bratislava. So the Serbian translation from Bratislava. So please read that. Our next speaker is Pavle Stojanovic, assistant professor from the Department of Philosophy, and he will give a talk on the topic, Can a skeptic be pious and should he be? Lessons from ancient Pyrrhonism. The floor is yours.
Just give us a few minutes.
Znači u folderu Sanskrit
Odlično. Samo da ga pročita. Evo ga. Konferencija. Science faith. Can skeptic be radi i sad prebacite samo se pomoći dvojno da prebaci na ovu mašinu. Da, da.
Živjeti valjda.
All right, thank you very much. My topic today is, can a skeptic be pious and should he be? Now, of course, because of the focus of our conference, the historical focus, we are looking at an example from ancient skepticism, more specifically ancient Pyrrhonism. I'm not going to be spending a lot of time explaining in much detail ancient Pyrrhonism. Hopefully you have some idea, but I will give a little bit of a foundation so that you can understand the context here, why this question is interesting. Because, I mean, right from the get-go, there's something weird about the idea of a skeptic being pious. But let's see how exactly the Pyrrhonists think about this, and more importantly, why. So the most important source of our knowledge about ancient Pyrrhonism is Sextus Empiricus, not necessarily because he was the smartest skeptic in the whole movement, but simply because we do have his works that have survived, unlike the works of other Pyrrhonian skeptics, unfortunately. So according to him, the Pyrrhonian skeptic begins his skeptical journey, if you wish, by noticing that in respect to everything, both in the context of ordinary life, as well as in the context of philosophy and science, there are mutually exclusive oppositions between various appearances and explanations. For example, the same tower appears round from a distance and then square from up close. In some cultures, adultery is considered wrong, while in others it is permissible. Some philosophers argue that the soul is immortal, others that it is mortal, and so on and so on. His writings are full with these examples of mutually exclusive ideas, appearances, beliefs about all sorts of things. That serves to establish this first step in the skeptic's journey, which is the observation, if you wish, that everything around us seems to be in some kind of dispute, in some kind of collision. After careful consideration, the skeptic realizes that all these opposing appearances and explanations are equally persuasive. Now, this is, I think, where the skeptic starts to deviate from what most other people are experiencing. And the skeptic believes, or I should say, doesn't believe, but notices that he's unable to rationally decide between these alternatives, these different explanations or appearances that he is experiencing. Because of this, the skeptic suspends belief about the real nature of things. These things can be of ethical nature, can be of scientific nature. The suspension of belief here that we are talking about is universal or global, if you wish. So it covers everything. Finally, the skeptic discovers that the suspension of belief has resulted in a special state of mind. So it brings the skeptic into a special state of mind, which they called ataraxia, or tranquility, or freedom from disturbance. Now, of course, what they mean here is freedom from unavoidable disturbance, because they do not deny that the skeptics are still bothered by certain things that cannot be avoided, such as hunger, the need for sleep, thirst, and so on and so on. But when it comes to everything else that is not unavoidable, their goal is to eliminate any kind of disturbance by applying this skeptical method. So the sequence we have here is something like this: oppositions, equal persuasiveness, suspension, and then tranquility. Now, in this last thing, I guess, is where the Pyrrhonians are special compared to what you would normally consider skeptical philosophy, right? So this addition that the goal, that first of all, that skepticism has a goal, that the goal is of practical nature, and that the goal is actually tranquility or peace of mind or freedom from disturbance. And this is going to be crucial for answering our question today. Let me say a few words about ataraxia. So, since it plays such an important role, let's look at a text that describes a little bit of what ataraxia is all about. We do not take the skeptics to be undisturbed in every way. We say that they are disturbed by things which are forced upon them. For we agree that at times they shiver and they are thirsty and give other feelings, have other feelings of this kind. But in these cases, ordinary people are afflicted by two sets of circumstances, by the affections themselves and no less by believing that these circumstances are bad by nature. We can skip this paragraph. The skeptics who shed the additional belief that each of these things is bad in its nature come off more moderately than in these other, even in these cases. So in other words, the skeptic is at an advantage compared to any other person or any other philosopher of some competing school, in that they, by applying this method, they manage to eliminate all unnecessary troubles that beliefs in the true nature of things can cause in their mind, in their soul. Now, let's look at their views about piety. In book 1 of his work, Outlines of Pyrrhonism, Sextus provides a general account of how the skeptics are supposed to conduct their lives. This is what he says. Holding to that which appears, we live without beliefs, in accordance with the observations pertaining to life. For we are incapable of being completely inactive. These observations pertaining to life seem to be fourfold, consisting in the guidance of nature, the necessitation of affections, tradition of laws and customs, and in the instruction in crafts. Now, what's most important for us here is this point where Sextus tells us that the skeptics follow laws and customs of their society. So in accordance with the tradition of customs and laws, we receive from life the view of piety as good and impiety as bad. I don't have the time to get into the remaining three, so we can skip that because it's not really important for our topic today. The second text goes to the beginning of book 3, which deals with the views of dogmatic philosophers, meaning everybody else. On physics and ethics, Sextus says the following. Since the majority of philosophers have asserted that God is the most active cause, let us first investigate views about God, remarking by way of preface that following life in manner devoid of beliefs, we say that there are gods and we are pious towards the gods. And we say that they are provident, while it is against the rashness of the dogmatists that we make the following points. And then he goes on to, dismantle, in his view at least, or as they would say today in these YouTube videos, to debunk everybody else. But the point in this paragraph is that the skeptic will say, in a manner devoid of beliefs, whatever that is, that there are gods and that the skeptics are pious towards gods. And the final text, and against the physicists, Sextus tackles the arguments of the dogmatists on gods in more detail, and then he makes the following conclusion. Since not everything that is conceived also shares in reality, but something can be conceived but not be real, like the Hippocentaur or Scylla, it will be necessary after our investigation of the conception of the gods to inquire also into their reality. For perhaps the skeptic will be found to be safer than those who do philosophy in another way, in line with his ancestral customs and laws. He says that there are gods and does everything that tends to worship of and reverence towards them. But as far as philosophical investigation is concerned, the skeptic makes no rash moves. Of those who have inquired into the reality of God, then, some say that there is a God, some that there is not a God, and some that there no more is than is not. Most of the dogmatists and the common preconception of life say that there is God. Those labeled atheists say that there is not. And the skeptics say that there is no more than there are not gods, because of the equal strength of the opposing arguments for and against the existence of gods. So here's the situation that we have. On the one hand, the skeptics insist that they don't believe in the existence of gods. But on the other hand, they say that the skeptic is pious, or should be pious, and that the skeptic should say, if somebody asks them, what do you think? Is there a God? Yes, of course, gods exist. Why? It seems like a very schizophrenic situation. So, if he truly suspends belief about everything, we would expect the skeptic to be either disinterested in this whole business about religion, or at least to be equally disposed both towards and against the idea of obeying gods, respecting them, and so on. But that's not what we find in the texts, as we have seen. So there is a problem there, or at least it appears to be. So I have two questions here that I want to try to answer. The first one is, can the skeptic do this without betraying his skepticism? Can he be pious in some sense, whatever that sense is? And the second, why would he want to do this? So even if the skeptic can be pious, what's the reason? What's the motivation? So to answer the first question, I want to propose rather straightforwardly that it is perfectly possible for one to engage in pious behavior and pious practices without holding any pious beliefs, any beliefs about God, religion, and so on. This may sound a little bit strange, maybe, but when I give you a couple of examples, I think many of you will actually see that this is actually not such a big deal. Can one, for example, say Merry Christmas, or attend a mass, or sign in a church, sing in a church choir without believing that God exists? Some of you have probably done it. So it seems that the answer is yes. Just like one can, for instance, be faithful to his wife without holding the belief that adultery is morally wrong. I guess that's also possible. I'm referring back to Sex's example with customs and laws that are not really related to religion. So I see no reason to think that saying pious things or even acting piously necessarily presupposes holding beliefs with pious content. Now, I underline this because this sort of behavior might actually presuppose certain other beliefs of different content, but I'm not going to go into that because the focus now is on beliefs about God, respecting gods, believing in providence, and so on. Even if there are other beliefs that are required here, they would not really be related to this particular issue. So let's move on to the second question, which is, I think, much more interesting. Why would the skeptic want to act piously? This part of the problem is not only more interesting, but I think a little bit more difficult to understand here. We have seen that the skeptic's ultimate aim is ataraxia, freedom from disturbance, being mentally tranquil by anything, or untroubled by anything except the unavoidable necessary things. Now, Sextus never explicitly says that the purpose of this pious behavior of the skeptic is related to ataraxia, but I think that is actually the direction where we should be trying to discover or to solve the puzzle of this motivation. Namely, saying that gods exist and engaging in religious rituals observed by the community in which he lives could actually help the skeptic avoid unnecessary disturbances and achieve and maintain his ataraxia. So let's look at a little bit of a more concrete and specific examples how being pious might actually help the skeptic maintain his peace of mind. Now, first, I do not mean here only the external disturbances that may arise from disregarding religious customs, like, for example, being ostracized by your community or persecuted because you're not going to church or something like that. The skeptics didn't really seem to be bothered much by this. I primarily mean eliminating the effect of holding beliefs that may be involved in actively avoiding pious behavior that is common in his community. Namely, recall that the skeptic acquiesces to things that arise from his life's experience. If he has been brought up in a culture in which most people believe that gods exist and in which most people actively display this belief through religious rituals, he would be predisposed, habituated, even trained, you may say, to behave in the similar way. Because remember, the skeptic is not born from the little baby as a skeptic. It really doesn't really happen like that. It's somebody who later in their life, if ever, becomes a skeptic. So there's a whole portion of the skeptic's life where he is just sort of brought up like any normal person within a particular social context. And if that context is religious, then he will probably be involved in that or immersed in that culture in which he was born. Now, breaking these habits, going against this training, would arguably require believing that there are strong reasons to do so. And these are precisely the sorts of beliefs that can unnecessarily upset the skeptic and jeopardize his ataraxia. So essentially, if you're born in a community that is religious and you were sort of you're used to that kind of behavior, thinking, and so on, in order to break with that, you need extra effort. You need reasons to say, okay, now this is all wrong and I'm not going to do that anymore. Now that actually is the step which goes beyond what the skeptics are prepared to allow for themselves. That's actually more disturbing than actually just going along with the motions of whatever the situation you're brought up in. Consider the following example. If I've been brought up from childhood in a Christian family that places great care and effort in organizing a celebratory family dinner each Christmas or Easter, deciding to break this ritual that I've grown accustomed to over the years would require me to accept and act on a belief to the effect that since I find reasons for the existence and non-existence of Christian God to be of equal strength, I should no longer participate in these festivities. On the contrary, it seems that passively continuing to participate and going through all the motions, even though I suspend my belief in the existence or non-existence of the Christian God, would be more in accordance with my skeptical indifference than taking active steps to disengage from the established practice. So the motivation for the skeptic to act piously in this context of a pious community is the fact that it contributes to his ataraxia more than acting impiously. That's the essence of my claim or my argument. And just sort of by way of ending this on a more controversial note, I guess, I want to address one potential objection here, namely the objection from conformism. Because if the skeptic's method leads him to always obey the existing laws and customs of his community, even when they are, for whatever reason, problematic, then isn't he merely a conformist, just a pathetic yes man? Now, I think that this objection or this implication that is embedded in this objection is actually valid. It can hardly be denied. The skeptic's approach, which takes ataraxia as the only ultimate goal, life goal, does indeed make him a staunch anti-reformist and anti-revolutionary. Not just when it comes to religion, but everything else, ethics, politics, you name it. However, the Pyrrhonian skeptic is perfectly content with this. That much is clear from Sextus's writings. It's as though he tells us, if I'm a conformist, so what? I am still much better off than being a reformist or a revolutionary in terms of the peace of my mind, right? So doesn't really matter. He sort of bites the bullet there. But I think there still might be something to this objection. In his effort to avoid all unnecessary mental disturbances and attain and maintain mental tranquility, the skeptic does rid himself of the potential pleasures and excitements experienced by reformists or revolutionaries. And insofar as there may be some important value in these, I'm not saying that there is, but if there is, then the skeptic is indeed pitifully deprived of these. However, if this is the case, the issue here would not be a matter of the skeptic's inconsistency, but rather of his perhaps misguided choice of the ultimate goal of his life, which is ataraxia. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk, and I hope there will be a question.
Thank you very much for your enlightening presentation. I like Pyrrhonism, and I would like to know, okay, if we take it in this way, that atheist in ancient culture was a person who believed that God or gods exist, but didn't pay attention to them. We can say that Pyrrhonists were atheists in this regard. And do you really think that it was something particular to Pyrrhonists to act like that, in conformity with the culture where they lived, which was pious, they were pious as well, because this was done by everyone. Cicero did not believe in pagan gods, but he worshipped, he observed some things, you know, some practices. So would it be really something special for Pyrrhonists? Or is it that they said to themselves, maybe, okay, gods exist, don't exist, but it's better to worship them somehow or not? Thank you.
Right. Thank you for the question. So, first of all, I mean, Cicero was not a Pyrrhonist. He was a skeptic of some sort, more an academic skeptic, but then again, there's different sort of levels of academic skepticism, and perhaps Cicero is perhaps I'm not, it's not entirely clear, but of the lighter kind, right? So Carneades and then his followers, more than Arcesilaus, who was a little bit more radical. Now, perhaps the Epicureans are the most, extreme example, I think, of philosophers in this period who show more or less open disregard for the traditional religion. Yes, even though they also believe there are some sort of gods, completely different from what the masses think. But then again, the Stoics also had a completely different idea of gods than the normal people, and they were much more conservative and much more conformist. Now, is this something special that the skeptics are doing? I think it is a little bit, because it seems to me that the other philosophers who also didn't really buy into the folk religion, but still didn't really openly show disrespect, they did it either because they didn't really care much, or because they just wanted to be safer on the practical level, not persecuted, not, burned at the stake or something like that. Right, but I think that what's unique perhaps for Pyrrhonists, if my interpretation is correct, is that it actually is the integral part of their philosophical system or teaching, if you wish. it actually, they don't do it just because they want to stay safe, but they do it because it actually contributes to their philosophical goal. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's how it seems to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much once again, Pavle. And now we are
Question.
inviting one more question, but we don't have enough time for that.
Okay.
So yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our next speaker is our PhD student, Ana Shumenkovic. And she will give a talk on this topic, doctors on trials, the physician as a witness in the Demosthenes oration contra Cononem. Just a few minutes, few seconds for her to prepare presentation.
Vi slobodno na otvaram. Recite mi, jel imate USB-u ili u redu, jel imate HDMI ulaz na... Ne, ima bukvalno, prebacite na, evo vam USB prazan, molim vas prebacite recimo ovde. Beži. Izvolite. Vam treba pomoć? Da nam jedan ili dve kratke commercials.
One kabel se povezuje ovdje. She might be
Da, u ruci, slobodno. Samo mi dole. Ja imam sad na... Sekund. Da, samo prvo da prebacim. I još jednom, ako možete mi kažete ime,
Doctors on trial.
Jel baš počinje sa Doctors. Doctors and Trials Bibliotheks. Odlično. Izvolite kolega. Doctors and Trials.
So, thank you for having me. So, the theme of my paper is Doctors on Trials, the Physician as a Witness on Demosthenes contra Cononem. So since oratory is not only an invaluable contemporary source for social history, but could also refine our understanding of certain events long past and help us better understand the dynamic speaker wanted to create, the main thought behind this study, based on an analysis of Demosthenes' speeches, is to outline the position and standing of physicians in 4th century Athens, represented by the role health and healers had in Demosthenes' orations. Since health and healers are both deeply rooted in the divine, in ancient Greece, both healing and bringing diseases is Apollo's domain, along with divination, lustration, legislation, incantation, and poetry. In Iliad, Apollo both causes the plague that tormented the Greeks to revenge all the hurts and the offense heaped upon both him and his priest, and heals it. In accordance to the ethnomedical principle, he that wounds shall make whole. And we have in Iliad, in the first book, the depiction of how Apollo got angry and why. Rudra acts similarly in Vedic India. So this Apollo's positive side was institutionalized in his provincial son, Asclepius, a famous physician who was struck by Zeus's bolt after committing the Hebrews by reviving the dead. This deity from Thessaly started gaining popularity in the 4th century BC. His shrines, notably the great ones on the island of Kos and Epidaure in the Peloponnese, were also centers of scientific medicine. Greek physicians were already famous in the 6th century and were appreciated far and wide, as we can see from the example of Theseus of Cnidus, court doctor of Persian ruler Artaxerxes II, or from Callimachus' poems Asclepiades, dedicated to his friend, physician Philippus, written in medical tone. And even Aristotle came from medical family with connections to the Macedonian court. But as we see from common enough jokes and stories, doctors were sometimes seen as conjurers, while also contritely regarded as a source of great authority, which could even be transferred to those lacking. Maybe this is the reason behind such meticulous care to distinguish medicine from irrational medicine in several early treatises. Nevertheless, the statues of physicians and their work remained interspersed with the domain of fate and destiny, certainly well into the late 3rd century BC, probably later. Demosthenes was born in 384 BCE, almost 2 decades after the Peloponnesian War ended. This traumatic event, the supremacy war between Athens and Sparta, which lasted for almost 30 years, left Greece in a state of turmoil and aftershocks. One of the latter was Theban victory in the Battle of Leuctra, which had put an end to the traditional bipolar alignment of polis. The rise of Macedon, with Philip II coming to power, further contributed to the declining autonomy of Greek city-states and several clashes between Macedonians and Athenians. Situation culminated in 338 BC with the Battle of Chaeronea. Demosthenes fought in this battle as a mere hoplite. He managed to incite several insurrections against Macedonians and survived them all until Alexander's successor Antipater quelled Athenian opposition for the final time. Demosthenes rather committed suicide than fall in his enemy's hands in 332 BCE. But such was his influence that in 280 BC, more than 40 years after his death, his nephew Demochares persuaded Athenians to commission and set up Demosthenes' statue in Agora at the state's expense, and this is the face of that statue that we see. Okay, well, what does it have to do with Demosthenes' speech against Conon? Well, against Conon starts with speaker's Ariston's statement that following the advice of his family and friends, maybe even Demosthenes himself, he decided to charge Conon with a less serious private suit for assault, though he could press on with a more serious charge of hubris and robbery, providing first unnamed witnesses for his case. We learned that Conon, supported by a number of his friends, attacked Ariston and his friend Panostratus in a drunken state. Ariston, severely beaten, received first help from the passers-by, and on their way to his home, the group was met by the victim's relative, Euxiteus, and a friend, Medius. Ariston then goes on to describe his injuries, obviously using his physician's phrases, lending the doctor's authority to his less than ideal credibility. At that time, then, as the immediate result of the blows and the maltreatment I received, I was brought into this condition, as you hear from my own lips, and as all the witnesses who saw me at that time have testified. Afterwards, although the swellings on my face and the bruises my physician said did not give him great concern, continuous attacks of fever ensued and violent and acute pains throughout all my body, but especially in my sides and in the pit of my stomach, and I was unable to take my food. Indeed, the surgeon said that if a copious hemorrhage had not spontaneously occurred, while my agony was extreme and my attendants were at their wits' end, I should have died of internal suppuration, but as it was, the loss of blood saved me. To prove now that these statements of mine are true and that from the blows which these men dealt me, there resulted an illness so severe that it brought me to the point of death, read the depositions of the surgeon and of those who came to see me, and then the depositions are read. Presumably, it is now Euxiteus and Medius who testify about Ariston's injuries, as does the doctor. A doctor, the same one perhaps, and others also testify about the severity of Ariston's injuries and the difficulties of his convalescence. With those testimonies, Ariston's case appears complete, but he continues anticipating Conan's excuses of being only a bystander, pointing out that even verbal assault is against the law. Then once again, the story revolves around witnesses. Ariston accentuates Conan's insisting that witnesses swear to their testimony. And finally, when Conan suggests the torture of several of Ariston's slaves, Ariston and his witnesses call out his challenge as a delaying tactic. Ariston compares Conan's witnesses, his drinking buddies, notorious libertines and brutes, whose testimony was manufactured to suit Conan's needs, to his own independent passers-by and a doctor. And those are the sorts of witnesses one ought to produce before the democratic court, once again ascertaining the importance and social standing of his witnesses, a physician amongst them. Then Ariston goes on to condemn Conan's involvement of his family, and especially his anticipated oaths upon their heads. So when he offers his free oath, it is conventional in accordance with the entire oration. I swear by all the gods and goddesses, for your sake, men of the jury, and that of the bystanders, that I have, in very truth, suffered at the hands of Conan this wrong for which I am suing him, that I was beaten by him and that my lip was cut open so that it needed stitches, and that it is because of gross maltreatment that I am prosecuting him. If I swear truly, may many blessings be mine, and may I never again suffer such an outrage. But if I commit perjury, may I perish utterly, and all I possess or ever may possess. Now we finally get to the core of Ariston's landing of authority in any way possible, be it by witnesses or physician's dignity or even religion itself. It seems that he was no stranger to such brawls, at least judging by Conan's assessment that the dicasts would deem those allegations against Ariston credible. Furthermore, it seems that this incident had some kind of religious background and that both Ariston and Conan's sons were members of rival groups. But where Ariston had at least a simulacrum of understanding for the misjudgments of the youth, he had none for the actions of a grown man, and he depicts the actions of Conan's group as an inversion of and contempt for conventional values. More than that, by linking religious offenses to Conan, Ariston characterizes him as a sacrilegious villain, a not uncommon feat in oratory to this day. This is not a sole instance when Demosthenes uses this lexeme physician in his oratory. According to preliminary research, he uses this lexeme, as we can see, 9 times total in 6 speeches. And he uses it in 3 different ways. First group of results are those where Demosthenes uses the lexeme physician in a general sense in his speeches against Evergus and Necibulus and against Conan. When then the news of what had been done was brought to me by Peireus by the neighbors, I went to the farm but found that these men had left. I saw, however, that the household gods had been carried off, and in what plight the old woman was. My wife told me that what had taken place. So early next morning, I approached Theophemus in the city, having witnesses with me, and demanded first that he accept payment of the amount of his judgment and go with me to the bank, then that he should provide for the care of the old woman, whom they had beaten, calling in any physician whom they pleased. The speaker here demanded that the wrong be righted and any physician called in. Several passages down in the same speech, the speaker again reminds his audience of a physician needed but not called in, and then proceeds to state that he had called on one who claimed the situation was hopeless. So in this, in Demosthenes 47:67, the lexeme physician was used twice. The first time, similarly to what we have seen in the previous passage, and the second time differently concerning a certain physician, yet an unnamed one. This is close to how Demosthenes uses this lexeme in his speech against Conon, as we have seen. The second group of results are those where Demosthenes uses this lexeme in an individual sense. He even lets us glimpse the real physicians mentioned by name in two speeches. In speech against Apaturius, the speaker mentions by name a certain physician, Eryxias, an intimate friend of Aristocles, and obviously smarter of the two, since he came up with a plan against the speaker. Aristocles promised that he would produce the articles, but up to this day has not brought them to light. He did meet us on the appointed day at the Hephaestion, but made the excuse that his slave, while waiting for him, had fallen asleep and lost the document. The man who concocted this plot was Eryxias, the physician from Piraeus, an intimate friend of Aristocles, the same man who, out of enmity toward me, had also got up this action against me. Now comes a rather positive role of a named physician, Eutydicus, who told the whole truth to the court of Areopagus. And if Eutydicus, the physician to whom these men had gone in the first instance, asking him to make a cut on the head of Boetius, had not told to the court of the Areopagus the whole truth, this man would have taken such vengeance upon me, who was guilty of no wrong toward him, as you would not try to inflict on those who were guilty of the greatest wrongs toward you. That I may not be brought to be slandering him, please read the depositions. The third group of results brings us back to the communal grounds based on the state speech in which the lexeme physician was used in 3 speeches. In the third Olympiac oration, Demosthenes was supporting Olympus' plea for help. This speech was delivered sometime in 349 BCE, like the 2 previous orations. Although given Demosthenes' pessimistic stance in this speech, it was probably much later than the first 2 orations. Here, Demosthenes not only criticizes a new type of orators who do not lead but follow the demos, nor appeal to the greater good but do what is pleasing. He extends his criticism to Athens of his time, comparing it to Athens that existed between the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. Demosthenes paints a gloomy picture of Athens, where private houses of the orators are more stately than the public buildings. There is still hope if Athenians find their courage and follow the examples laid by their forefathers. Otherwise, they will continue to exist in this neither living nor dead state. If, therefore, even at the 11th hour, you can shake off these habits and consent to fight and act as becomes Athenians and to devote the abundant resources that you have at home to the attainment of success abroad, perhaps, men of Athens, perhaps you may gain some important and unqualified advantage and may be quit of these paltry perquisites, like the diet prescribed by doctors, which neither restores the strength of the patient nor allows him to succumb. So these doles that you are now distributing neither suffice to ensure your safety nor allow you to renounce them and try something else. They only confirm each citizen in his apathy. In similar metaphor, in first speech against Aristogeiton, the speaker compares Aristogeiton to a monster and urges his compatriots to expel him, like a physician cauterizes or cuts away cancer, an ulcer, or some other incurable growth. Surely then, to admonish such a fellow is madness. A man who never yielded or shrank before the storm or protest with which the whole assembly admonishes those who offend it would readily heed the protest of an individual. His case is incurable, men of Athens, quite incurable, just as physicians, when they detect a stranger or a cancer or an ulcer or some other incurable growth, cauterize it or cut it away, so you ought all to unite in exterminating this monster. Cast him out of your city, destroy him. Take your precautions in time and do not wait for the evil consequences, which I pray may never fall either on individuals or on the community. And the similar attitude can be seen in the second speech against Aristogaton. This is clearly so because we can see that those cities are best ordered which have given birth to best lawgivers. Whereas these tempers of the body are arrested by the discoverers of physicians, so savagery is expelled from the soul by the wise purposes of the legislator. To sum up, we shall find nothing venerable or admirable which is not associated with the law. So, the portrait of a physician that emerges from these orations is one of undoubted social dignity and authority. The doctor's authority is so great that it can compensate even the complicated history of the accuser, as we have seen in Ariston's case, in Demosthenes' oration against Conon. The fact that Demosthenes finds it important to highlight that Ariston's witnesses are the sort of witnesses one ought to produce before the democratic court shows that the social standing of doctors was really disputed. Physician's authority over Ariston's potentially trouble his witnesses. Conon, when we take into consideration Demosthenes' audience, his goals in using the lexeme physician, and the way he used it, we see three distinctive groups. First, a sort of state speech where Demosthenes compared physical health of an individual to metaphorical health of a state or a legislator. Then there are the results where he used this lexeme in a general sense, almost always appealing to emotion. And finally, in the third type of the results, Demosthenes used the lexeme physician in an individual sense, even naming some physicians. We believe that much more could be gleaned from this aspect of orations in general, and that those issues warrant more than a preliminary research, which would help us better understand social relations and problems of adequacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, there is no, I don't know if you can hear me. Yes, okay. We have time just one question. So if anyone would like to pose a question. If not, we are going to coffee break, so it is also perfectly right. So we will have a short coffee break and then come again at, I think, 5 o'clock, 5 o'clock sharp. Thank you very much.
Petre, ime dedino, dođi vamo. Ajde da probamo da se uključiš još jednom da vidimo i on radi. Test, jedan, da? Da li možeš da sam mutuješ? Mutovan si, Petre.
Me čuješ sad? Test, test. 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 Da li se čujemo? Test, test, test. Test. Test, test. Test. Da li se čujemo? Test.
Test jedan, da?
Test. Test. Test, test. Da li se čujemo? Da li se čujemo?
Test jedan, dva, test.
Test,
Test, test.
test,
Ne čujem te,
test.
Petre. Neću, hvala vam, hvala vam.
Ne čujemo se. Test, test. 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 Test, test. Da li se čujemo?
Petre, molim te da probamo test.
Test, test. 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 Jel se čujemo? Test. Test, test, test. Test. Ne čujemo se, a?
Čuješ se nam malo. Treba da smislimo kako da ovo pošaljemo. Što je dobro. Da... Reci nešto.
Test, test.
Ajde, opet.
Test, 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 test.
Благодарим. Samo jedan trenutak da namestimo zvuk. U stvari moram, čekaj, samo prebacim pred. Prosto recite mi kako se zove vaša akreditacija.
Zove se Superstition, da. Superstition, da. Superstition.
U redu. Izvolite, hvala vam najlepše. Dio, wireless mikrofon. Sad,
Imat ćemo problem. Kada bude ovo ušio, imat ćemo problem kako da na projektor morat ćemo da vratimo onaj, kako da na projektor bacimo sliku sa Zooma, ono što su online.
da, morat ćemo da
Bacimo tvoj laptop na projektor.
tako je.
Da.
Da, ali nećemo ni namestiti zvuk onda.
Nije bitno, ako se ne čuju bubice ovde preko razglasa, bitno da čujemo Petra kako nam nešto priča.
To ne čujem.
To ne čujem.
Probaj da menjaš
Sve
vidi za ove redno.
Bukvalno sam ih sve probao.
Aha. Yes.
Da, samo se
Moram
ne
da
znam šta sam ja uradio prošli put pa je to radilo. Wireless. Ajde, pričaj.
Test, 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 test.
Vidiš? A ako idem, znači... Ajde sad,
Test, test.
koje su na laptopu.
Maksim je tu, možeš čak i da ga pitaš da testirate, ali idi na pauzu.
Da, moramo da ga napravimo. Pustit ćemo da završimo.
Da, bukvalno.
Ja se čujem sad.
Dobar dan, poštovanje, odlično što ste tu. Ako možemo samo da uradimo kratak test. Hvala vam najlepše. Samo da vidimo da vas osposobimo da se čujete preko razglasa. Dajte mi jedan trenutak, molim vas.
Dobro. Ovo u laptopu bacivao onaj njihov... To.
Da li mogu da vas zamolim da kažete bilo šta u mikrofon?
Dobro veče, dobar dan. Da li me čujete dobro?
Čujemo vas odlično, hvala. Da li vi čujete mene?
Odlično vas čujem. Kako me vidite?
Vidimo vas odlično, samo trenutak da vas da probamo na veliki ekran. Da li mogu da vas zamolim da idete na ovo dugme share, da podelite vaš ekran, da vidimo samo da li imamo pristup vašem ekranu kada budete delili?
A nemam ništa da delim.
A, u redu, onda fenomenalno, onda može samo vaš lik i da govorite. Hvala vam najlepše. U principu sa naše strane sve funkcioniše fenomenalno. Vaše uključivanje je poslednje, ako se ne varam.
Moje u 17 časova, prvo.
Aha, 17.
Čekaj, to nam se onda razlikuje. Samo da pozovem nekog iz organizacije.
Oprostite jedan trenutak, samo da vidimo sa nekim iz organizacije, pošto ste vi kod mene na spisku od poslednji slot. Dajte mi jedan trenutak, samo molim vas.
Aha, ja sam dobio informaciju da sam u 17. To mi je i jedini slobodan termin. Ako možete da proverite sa organizatorom.
Mislim da neće biti nikakav problem da će moći od 17 da bude vaše sledeće uključenje, pa ćemo pomeriti gospodina koji je bio zakazan pre vas za sledeći slot, ako to odgovara.
Pa da, možda i moja nepažnja dovela do toga da sam pomislio da je nečije drugo, da je moje prvo. Da.
Evo, sve je dogovoreno, Maksime, oprostite, molim vas na zbunjivanju, znači vi ste od 17 časova, sve je spremno, tako da...
Da, i već smo uključeni, tako da ćete, kad budete rekli, ja ću da uključim moju kameru, da aktiviram i da se obratim. Slobodno je tako.
Potvrdio sam, gospodine Reći. Evo još jednom, gospodine Maksim, samo da potvrdimo, znači vi ste od 17 časova, sve je spremno, u 17:00 možete opet da pustite svoju kameru i možemo da počnemo sa vašim predavanjem ako je sve u redu.
Znači za 10 minuta, je li tako?
Tako je, tako je.
Hvala lepo.
Hvala vam najlepše, vidimo se uskoro.
Sve na engleskom, izvinite.
Oprostite?
Predavanja su na engleskom, je li tako?
Tako je, tako je.
Aha, dobro. Samo da proverim.
Je li ovo, što je ovo? Što je ovaj, samo da bude slobodno. To bi trebalo da je...
Ali imamo još 10. Ovo nečije da dam, da vratim, da...
Ne, mi ćemo sve, hvala vam.
Ovo je moje, ali nema onaj kako. Nema veze, mislim.
Potražit ćemo negde. Samo da završimo sa maksimum koji ćemo da nađemo.
Da, kako samo da dajem gospodinu Maksima da se tamo molim. To bi trebalo da je to. Ovo je njegova fotografija, gospodin ugasio video pa kako bude upalio.
Da, ali ne bi trebalo da vidimo naš ekran.
Kako najbrže reši.
Šta?
Kažem, ovo je remote ko najbrže reši. Nemamo vremena. Moraš da ga gledaš na onom tamo, tamo je sad.
Ne znam zašto, brate. Kako da ga privučem vama?
Čekaj, ja ću odavde da ga vidim. To. Idem da zapalim, on ću čekam do dola, a stignem ću ti.
Možete vidjeti.
Troje za sad. Troje je online. I ne znam, tokom celog dana, trenutno ih je troje uključeno. Samo ko iz publike bude htio da postavi neko pitanje, postavi ga na mikrofon isto kao i... Tako je, ili ja, ili sve jedno. Samo vi možete da najavite, imamo dve. Daću vam ja drugu, vi se najavite, tako je, i on krene da prezentuje. Kada on završi, vi pitate ili ima nekih pitanja, ili ću ja da dam mikrofon kome već bude trebalo. Kada se to završi, ako je neko online isto ima da pita, oni će čuti vašu najavu ako ima nekih pitanja, dići će ruku ili će neko da u chatu napiše nešto.
Uglavnom, ako to bude, ko će se vidjeti ovdje.
Sve će se vidjeti.
Ako vidim i chat i ono, to...
Tako je, pogledajte da li je neko digao ruku, da li se neko javio.
Bitno ću ja vidjeti sve ljude koji su... Znači, kao normalno na Zoomu. Kako neko ne želi da govori, ja možda da ostavi pitanje u chatu, pa mogu ja da počitam pitanje, to je isto.
Neko bude kod vas, a ovu drugu ću da stavim Noelu kada bude on govorio.
Dobro.
To ćemo samo... Tako je. To ćemo davati ili vi ili ja nekome iz publike ako bude hteo da postavi neko pitanje.
Isključivanja nema, inače ovako tako je tako...
Tako je. Samo bitno je gorica crvena lampica.
Crvena.
Da, to je to.
Ja sam, možemo da se uključimo. Samo ljudi da stavimo. Da stavimo i da počnemo.
Oprostite, Maksime, da li nas čujete, da li možete da nam date potvrdu?
Kako da ne?
Divno, hvala vam najlepše.
Good evening, možemo sada? Good morning in United States, Bishop Maxim. We have, do you hear me well?
Excellent.
Yes, yeah, excellent. We have our first speaker, this fourth session, is Bishop of the Serbian Orthodox Church, Maxim Vasiljević, and he will speak on the relational cosmos, exploring contingency, relationality, and mode of existence. Floor is yours, Reverend Bishop. And after that, we will have maybe some questions from here or online. Yeah, from the, okay.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I am honored and grateful to be invited to speak at this conference, the Science, Faith, and Superstition at the University Library in Belgrade. And it's a privilege to engage with such a distinguished gathering on this important topic. I hope I will at least for a little while meet the expectations of the organizer. I hope you can hear me. So in this presentation, I will focus on the concept of relational cosmos, because our understanding of the universe is undergoing significant shifts, as we all know. The traditional mechanistic view, which treats parts as independent entities, is being replaced by a new understanding, and it's centered on what we call relationality. So instead of viewing things as isolated, we now recognize them as fundamentally interconnected. And this paradigm shift, we can call it freely such, is having a profound impact on physics, where scientists are exploring a more holistic view of the cosmos, potentially leading to a unified theory of everything. And so in this presentation, I argue that modern physics has abandoned the idea of purely atomistic universe, and instead reveals a reality that is relational. Relationality is not